Little Germany is the exception to the rule with these talks, because I would imagine everybody in this room knows where Little Germany is. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes. The name Little Germany was given to this area, which I'll point out which area in case anybody doesn't know where we're talking about, because of the many German wool merchants who constructed buildings in this area during the 19th century, particularly Jewish German wool merchants. Now, as I've said already, it's unique in terms of the localities that I'm talking about, in that this was actually never created as a neighbourhood. So, Wapping next door, for instance, from the get-go was a neighbourhood of densely back-to-back terraced houses. Longlands was, Silsbridge Lane was, all these other places were, and very quickly became slums. That is not the case with Little Germany. Little Germany was created primarily as a commercial district right from the beginning. And it's also far from lost or forgotten like these other lost neighbourhoods I've talked about. It's somewhere that if you were to stop a Bradfordian in the street and ask, have you heard of Little Germany, they'd say yes, and the odds are they'd be able to tell you where it was. Not the case for a lot of these other places. So, modern boundaries are very well defined. That's not always been the case, though. There was a time when it was a bit difficult to say where Little Germany began and ended. So Church Bank and then Barker End Road up to the roundabout is sort of an obvious boundary at one side, to the northwest, till it meets the Shipley-Airedale Road. And then you would go down the Shipley-Airedale Road until you met Leeds Road. And then you go back in to the city centre along Leeds Road to the south. And then you go up Wells Street to the southwest until you met Church Bank. So it's basically this wedge here that's Little Germany. Now, before they built the Shipley-Airedale Road, the boundary was a bit more hazy along here. And generally speaking, today it is a lot easier to tell where Little Germany begins and ends. Leeds Road, again, is a road that was widened later on, which makes it more of a visible boundary. It's quite good for a district to have distinct boundaries. It sort of helps to sort of consolidate its identity, really. So, we have to go back to the 1850s to chart the start of Little Germany. So, Bradford's population swells to more or less 100,000 people. It's not as big as some other centres in the north, so Manchester was about 250,000 people, Leeds was about 101,000 people, but it was still significant, still a lot of people living in one area. And Bradford was becoming a bit of an internationally significant centre of commerce, for the wool textile industry. It began to attract attention overseas, and many German merchants saw the potential for moving to Bradford. This was especially the case later on in the 19th century after the Franco-Prussian War, which was sort of what I think was one of the last wars before Germany unified to become a single country. Because one of the consequences of that and the bitter relations that created between France and the new Germany was trade between the two countries started to become difficult. So you then start to look for other trading partners. So until the 1850s, the area that we're talking about, that is now Little Germany, was relatively underdeveloped. There's maps that show Bradford during the turn of the 19th century, show it to basically be mostly fields that are around there. A lot of the development that starts earlier on in Bradford is more towards where Bradford Beck is, along Thornton Road, sort of Goitside, Silsbridge Lane, Longlands, that end of Bradford really. less so this end. So this Dixon map of 1846 shows there's been some buildings in the surrounding area, there's been some development, but Little Germany is still pretty much open space. It is still pretty much fields. It had good proximity to the Bradford Canal, which had been finished and opened in the 1770s. It wasn't that far from Market Street Station, which had opened in 1846, so it was quite ideal in terms of transporting goods to and from these things. And I suppose there was an argument as well, getting in there before anyone else did, really. You know, that if this area didn't become the warehouse district, it'd probably start to get encroached by Wapping or by Eastbrook nearby, and probably just end up with bits of housing and other stuff. So, from 1855, this area starts to be developed. So you have German merchants who are coming along with designs for warehouse buildings mostly. And it begins around the bottom at Leeds Road and Vicar Lane. And the architecture is very different to anywhere else in Bradford. It's this neoclassical style, very much with an Italian influence. So I think that's another thing that really makes Little Germany stand out in comparison to a lot of these other places. A lot of the architecture in the other neighbourhoods surrounding was far from beautiful. You know, there was no aesthetic considered whatsoever when they were throwing up housing. You know, a lot of which was so cheap and so inadequate. Now, this area, some of it had been used for mining initially. I'm not quite sure whether that was coal mining or iron ore mining or what, but there was some sort of mining done in the area. So when they first started to build in this area, apparently there were difficulties with sinkholes opening and holes needing to be filled in and that sort of thing. I mean, they clearly managed to do it properly, because there's still so many buildings that are standing today, you know. So, started in 1855, and this district continues to expand up the hill. And by 1890, most of what we would now call Little Germany is finished. Its architecture is completed by that point. Nearly all the buildings are commercial in nature, but there was a chapel built. There was also a Quaker school that was housed on Chapel Street, so it wasn't entirely business use. And there were a few different names that were thrown around, because it wasn't like anybody came along and said, we now pronounce this area Little Germany. It sort of evolved over time. So Germania was a name that's quite often used. New Germany was a name as well that would often be used to describe the area. But by the 1870s or so, people seem to have settled on using Little Germany as a name for the district. I actually quite like that the names of so many of the places we've looked at seem to just develop over time, really. I suppose except for Ripleyville that we looked at this morning. But you know, if your surname's Ripley, it's a bit of a vanity project, really. So, in total, 85 buildings were put up between 1855 and 1890. Now, to date, 55 of these buildings are listed. Not all of them. There's a few ugly ones that have now been thrown in the mix. But the area, so it has this identity now, but it is tightly surrounded by the other districts that are encroaching on it. So Wapping on one side, Eastbrook on the other, George Street area on the other, and then the town centre. So back then it would not have been as easy as it is today to distinguish what was Little Germany and what wasn't Little Germany. And there may have been a little bit of subjectivity as to whether or not it was or wasn't Little Germany. It's a bit like, you know, do I live in Manningham or do I live in Heaton? You know, it depends where you're coming from, doesn't it? It comes from your point of view. And in some respects, it did look as though Little Germany was sort of merging with the Eastbrook district, which was a bit further up. And there are examples of that in the area. So there was the Eastbrook Chapel, which later became Eastbrook Hall, that's based in Little Germany. And that sort of reflects it. Does anybody know where the name Eastbrook comes from?
Brook to the east.
It's Brook. Yeah, Westbrook, around the college area in Lister Hill. Yes, so it's a stream basically, isn't it, that comes down the hill. More or less, I think it follows Leeds Road, and then we'll meet the Bradford Beck, I guess, when it gets to the bottom. There's an Eastbrook well as well around the area. I think that's sort of the bottom of Leeds Road, right near Wells Street. It's a surprise, isn't it? In 1929, the Bradford Civic Playhouse was founded by an amateur group, which met at Jarrett Hall at the bottom of Chapel Street. And J.B. Priestley became the president of the theatre in 1932, and he remains as president of the theatre until he died in 1984. Does everybody know who J.B. Priestley is? Anybody not know who J.B. Priestley is? Well, if they don't know, they're keeping quiet. Okay. 1935, the theatre was basically destroyed by fire, but a new theatre was built on the same site in 1937, now incorporating a cinema, and it became known as the Priestley, after J.B. Priestley. Now, the post-war period saw a general reduction in the size of the wool textile industry in Bradford. There'd been a few wobbles before the 20th century with wool textiles, where it suddenly looked like things were going in the wrong direction, but generally they didn't. But things did start to change. We've talked in previous sessions, people have talked about ideas as to why that might have been the case. There was a chap, I don't think he's here today, who said that it might have been a generational thing, that first generation of the industrialists, if you like, were very committed to their businesses, and then the second generation, who will have been sort of almost apprenticed in it, would have been almost as committed, but then perhaps by the third generation that started to lag a bit. I'm not entirely sure why the case is, but the sad thing is that the textile industry did start to decline in Bradford. And what this meant for Little Germany as a warehouse district was that many of the buildings became surplus to requirements. Some of them seemed to become redundant because it was like, well, what else are we going to do with them? They weren't, some of them weren't so easily repurposed. Little Germany started to become a bit of a backwater due to how the city centre was being remodelled, which I'm going to touch on again in a minute. But this, we started to go into a period where the heritage of Bradford mattered less, and the vision of the future was the car and concrete, and wasn't it the idea that you shouldn't have to walk more than 10 minutes or something once you parked up your car to get to everything. It was a very different time, and places like Little Germany with beautiful architecture didn't necessarily fit into the thinking of that time so well. So, Shipley-Airedale Road. Does everybody know where the Shipley-Airedale Road is? Right. Did you know that in the 1950s Bradford Council wanted to put it through Little Germany? That was the original plans. I think it was going to then connect with Canal Road, something like that, rather than the route that they finally decided. But basically, if they had have gone ahead with that plan, Little Germany would have just been flattened. There'd be nothing left today, arguably. I suppose the only complication might have been the cathedral, the other side, unless you'd moved it right in front of the cathedral or something like that. I don't know. Yes, so if the original plans for the Shipley-Airedale Road had come off, this entire district is likely to have been flattened. And originally as well, the Shipley-Airedale Road was intended to be a motorway rather than an A road, because the M606 was supposed to carry on straight through West Bowling and into the city centre. So I don't know, it may have ended up even wider and busier than what we finally ended up with. But in the end, the new road skirted the eastern part of Little Germany instead, as we know, and actual fact, one of the consequences of that is it actually defines the boundary of Little Germany a lot easier now, a lot clearer now than it perhaps was previously. There were other post-war road widening schemes which affected Little Germany. So Leeds Road was widened, and it resulted in things such as this pub, the Junction, being demolished, which was on the corner of Vicar Lane and Leeds Road. Apparently it was a very ornate pub inside. I've seen, and it's well before my time, but I have seen photographs of the interior and plans, and it looked pretty beautiful, really. That had to go. Now, the consequence of that again is that then on this side, the boundary becomes a bit more easy to see, a bit more defined. But another consequence is that Little Germany starts getting further cut off from the city centre. It's not really incorporated so much in the city centre. 1974, Bradford Council builds a 7-storey concrete extension onto Olicana House. Olicana House was a stone building, completely out of character for the area. Wouldn't be able to do that nowadays. And there's other building work that goes on during this time within Little Germany that starts to change its character. You start to see a lot more concrete going in Little Germany. So, arguably, it's gone from being this really beautiful, distinct district to a backwater, and it's starting to decline. It's not really being looked after. Now, this is Eastbrook Hall on Leeds Road, or Vicar Lane, bottom of Vicar Lane. By the 1980s, this beautiful building was empty and it had really become derelict. And in 1996, there was a fire. If anybody can remember the fire, and basically much of the building was destroyed. As far as I know, at one time at least, there was quite a big hall inside Eastbrook Hall. It was another beautiful building, really. Anyway, eventually, because I remember working at the job centre. It was the first job I got after I graduated. It was just the other side of Leeds Road. So I was unemployed, and then suddenly I was at the other side of the desk, and I was signing people up. But I remember this building and all the scorch marks on the front, and how much of an eyesore it was. And I mean, I didn't really know anything about it at the time, but I do remember wondering whether they would end up demolishing it or something. But eventually, thankfully, it was saved. It was converted into 57 apartments, and there were retail units put on the ground floor. But this front was really the only original feature that was left, and it's listed.
I think they had to remove it, didn't they? Block by block,
yes.
Block by block, and rebuild it again.
Yes, because of its listing, yes. But behind it, it's basically new.
Yeah. But it must have been a really major, major project to take that down.
I think it took a long time for it to be completed. The Prince of Wales now
What?
Charlie, King of Britain. He officially reopened the site in 2008, and apparently in his speech he emphasised the importance of the heritage of this architecture. You know, it's always been his bag, really, hasn't it? People recognise this?
Yeah.
Anybody tell me what it is?
Well, I asked you the question last week about it, so...
Oh, it was you, wasn't it?
Let's have a wait and
Yes,
see, yeah.
Isn't it the grandfather's clock or something?
Yes, it is, yes. I think it's one of these things that a lot of people walk past and think, what's all that about? You know, but it's nice. It's nice. You get a lot of people sitting in the chair and having their picture taken and that sort of thing. Yeah. So top of Chapel Street, there is this, a sandstone chair and a grandfather clock, and I think this is supposed to be a mirror, and it's called Grandad's Clock and Chair. And it was installed in 1992 by a sculptor called Timothy Shutter. So it's supposed to be an interpretation of a mill owner's office, comfortable chair, mirror, grandfather clock, that sort of thing. So it's basically a nod back to Bradford's industrial history. I think it's quite nice, really. It's quite unique, really. In many
Why is it on a slope? Is there any reason for that?
Oh, I don't know that.
Streets on the slope.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they couldn't afford to sort of level the street. That was,
They could have matched up the clock and the chair.
It's a nod to the decline of the textile.
maybe it gives you a reason to climb the hill,
Or the rise of the textile industry.
or the rise of the textile. It depends, doesn't it? Glass half full, glass half
Decline and
empty.
fall.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got to a point where Little Germany, and this photograph actually doesn't reflect it so well, it looks quite nice in that photo. But there was a point where it really was a tatty area. I mean, I remember as a child my mother taking me to, I think it was Sovereign Healthcare had their offices in Little Germany, and walking through with her.
Jean Straight and that red door there.
Yeah,
Sovereign.
yeah. And I don't know how old I was less than 10 anyway, and thinking, ugh, you know, it wasn't a place that looked attractive at all. I thought it was something from a war scene or something like that. It was just,
Easter, isn't it?
well, so many of the buildings just looked so dilapidated. Anyway, things did start to turn around. So 2002, the Chamber of Commerce, which had established its offices in Little Germany, it really decided to take the initiative. It wanted to regenerate Little Germany. It's interesting, actually, there's a parallel with this and with Goitzide, which we've talked about in the previous session. And I'd explained with Goitzide, Bradford Council was quite keen to jump in afterwards and try and take as much credit as possible. But again, Goitzide was a business-driven initiative to try and regenerate the area. So there was something called the Goitzide Partnership, which came up with a sort of vision for the area, which had meant that Sunbridge Road was going to become a bit like a high street, and there was going to be various developments. And they came up with a plan, a master plan for the area. They wanted Bradford Council to adopt as its plan. And in the end, Bradford Council adopted it as what they called supplementary planning guidance, which basically meant we can refer to it, but we don't have to follow it. We can ignore it if we want to. And unfortunately, Little Germany Partnership, which later became something called the Goitzide Development Partnership, which then became Goitzide Development Trust, ended up winding up. And I think a lot of the reason for that was because they just ended up not being able to do what they wanted to do. Goitzide was actually inspired by Little Germany and what went on in Little Germany first. So the the Chamber of Commerce set up something called the Little Germany Urban Village Company, and it produced a master plan of how the district could be improved, how Little Germany district could be improved and regenerated. So they wanted Bradford Council to classify it as a conservation area, which, that was another thing that Goitside Partnership wanted, and they got their way. It's a conservation area. And again, the Chamber got its way here. Little Germany is now a conservation area, which basically restricts what development you can do in the area. It's got to be within, it's got to be in keeping with the area. But it encouraged investors to put money into repurposing many of the buildings. And some of its successes included Mercury House and the Design Exchange. It similarly had an idea of it wanted Peckover, is it Peckover Street?
Yeah.
It wanted that to be a bit like a high street for Little Germany. So the idea was it was going to be a mix of business use, and you'd have different types of businesses that would be taking up space in these historic buildings, but you would also have residential use. So for the first time, Little Germany would start to become a neighbourhood, and you would actually have people living in Little Germany. And so a lot of the buildings started to go that way. I mean, Eastbrook Hall later did. I just mentioned about that. When city centre living started to be encouraged by the council, Little Germany was really high up there on the list of places that were promoted. And I actually knew a guy who'd been a regeneration officer in the council, and he bought an apartment in Little Germany. He sort of said, well, I really need to practice what I preach. And there were quite a lot of people for quite a long time that lived in Little Germany, and a bit of a community started to develop as well, which was good. On Peckover Street, you got a general shop, you got a little pub as well that opened. So there was actually a place that people could come and meet one another and get to know one another. And I'm trying to think when it was 2006, 2007. I did some work with residents of the city centre. I wanted to find out how much people in the city centre actually talked to one another and were aware of one another. And it ended up with a residents' association being set up for the centre. And we found that people in Little Germany had already started to get to know one another a lot more than in other places in the centre. In other places, people perhaps lived in a flat above a shop or something like that, or in another, like a warehouse that had been converted elsewhere, but they didn't really know the neighbours. There was no mixing, and I think a lot of it was because there wasn't the same opportunities perhaps for them to meet one another in the shop or in a pub or something so well within that area, if you like. Anyway, exciting stuff started to happen. There was a draft planning framework put together, which again was eventually adopted by Bradford Council, but as supplementary planning guidance, so they could ignore it if they wanted to. But having said all that, something was happening, things were going in the right direction generally. Yeah, so I would say for a time this was a very successful initiative, and it started kick-starting a lot of stuff going on. You did get quite a lot of businesses either relocating or setting up in Little Germany. So the Design Exchange became quite busy at one time. There's I don't know if it still operates. There was something called the Arts and Resource Centre for the community, which was. Is it still open? People?
Is that what the mosaic? So it worked in the 80s, a long time ago, but I think I did some volunteer work there about 10 years ago.
Right. It's up a bit of a hill, that's the thing. Is it on Chapel Street? You go through an archway. Yeah. It's a beautiful building.
There's all the mosaic on the wall.
Yeah. And I know from when I worked in the charity sector before in Bradford that they always struggled a bit with the maintenance of the place. I think that was the big difficulty. But very nice, very, very nice building. There was a really big meeting room upstairs in in the building, which was very nice. And is it Sunrise Radio? I think they might have their studios in Little Germany. Chamber of Commerce is still there. There's quite a few, business.
Penang Radio used to be as well.
Right. Yes, it did. Where are they now? Have they moved?
I don't even think it's still Penang Radio.
Oh, okay, right. So there was a lot of work that started to happen. You started to get people living in Little Germany, a lot of renovation work being done. And I would say it's arguable the feel and the appearance of the district started to become uplifted. And so, you could say that Little Germany was starting to become an example of successful city centre regeneration. If we're going to do it block by block, bit by bit, then maybe this is the way to do it. Maybe we could just copy this. And that's exactly what the Goitside Partnership tried to do later in the Goitside. So if you don't know where Goitside is, it's sort of between Thornton Road and Sunbridge Road, that area. It's mostly a warehouse area again. So I would say that certainly Little Germany suddenly started to be a case study at these conferences that they have about housing and urban development and that sort of thing. And of course, Bradford Council was involved, it wasn't the lead partner, if you like, but it certainly did want to take as much credit as it possibly could. And then this happened. What was the nickname for this? The hole in the ground. Yes, it's like a meteorite or something hit Bradford. So, 2006, buildings of Foster Square are demolished. So Central House and Foster House goes down. Roads are rerouted. And it wasn't supposed to be for very long, was it? So we're going to have a new modern shopping centre. And Westfield was going to be involved, who've done successful shopping centres elsewhere in the country. So when I worked at Bradford College, because I lived for a long time up the Aire Valley around sort of Skipton area, and I used to always come in on the train and get off at Foster Square, and this was the first thing that you got met with. They need to get on and shift it and do something about it. Anyway, it did become clear relatively soon after the demolition that Westfield had started to change its plans and was perhaps considering disposing of the site rather than developing it. But I think there was a lot of silence for a while about what was going on. There was a protest, wasn't there, at one point, I remember. I think some people got in and there was some sort of a protest. They did eventually, because it was taking so long, it sort of got landscaped, didn't it?
Yeah,
turned into
one end of it did.
Yeah.
That's right, yeah. I've actually got a photograph on the hoardings around the outside in red paint. Someone had written, "Give it back to the people," or something like that. Yeah.
I remember walking along one side and somebody had written, "This is your heritage," on the outside. I thought, well, that says a lot, really. So basically, before this got built, the reality was that Little Germany became even more isolated from the city centre. And it definitely did have a negative impact on the businesses that were in Little Germany. I used to go to the old barber's shop that's at the bottom of Bolton Road, and the guy who owned it told me once when I went in that he planned to retire and sell his business, and then the hole in the ground came along, and suddenly he just couldn't get anybody who was interested in buying it, and he had to delay his retirement plans for a long time, and he did finally sell his business years afterwards, but I don't think it was for what he thought it was worth. I think he had to let it go for a lot less, just to move on really from. And it wasn't just him, it was just suddenly people couldn't get round from the centre so easily to Little Germany. You'd have to have really good reason to do so. Eventually the site got sold to New River, and November 2015 the shopping centre is finally opened, the Broadway shopping centre, 9 years after this process started. It's quite a long time for development. And again, although, you know, depending upon your point of view, I mean, you can go out of the Broadway and into Little Germany from one of the entrances. Some people do also say, though, one of the consequences, Little Germany is now even more cut off from the rest of the city centre, because this shopping centre is sort of in the way, if you like, of the city centre, of Little Germany. I think it all depends upon your point of view.
But there's the height of it. Before the shops were a lower rise, and you used to be able to see the buildings, but now you wouldn't. Yeah, you wouldn't know Little Germany with there because you can't see it at all. Where before you could see it.
And then the bottom of Little Germany, they weren't particularly attractive, but there was a row of shops, wasn't there?
Shops,
yeah,
yes,
that got demolished because I think it was a concrete thing.
The other side of that coin, of course, is that it's helped to preserve Little Germany because the buildings are so different to everywhere else.
I guess the thing is, in the long run, a building needs to have a purpose. You know, it needs to have somebody looking after it and maintaining it. Otherwise, it will ultimately fall into disrepair.
Well, my daughter's office is in Little Germany.
Right. Okay.
So that's an example of people using it.
Okay.
My daughter's about to move in there next month to an apartment.
Right. Okay. Right. So, by now the Little Germany Urban Village Company had been wound up. That initiative had gone. But there was another body called Little Germany Action that was formed. This, my friend who I mentioned, who used to be a regeneration officer, he actually set that up with, and it was a mix of residents and people who were business owners in Little Germany. And basically its purpose was to try and carry on the regeneration of Little Germany and try and resolve, you know, problems as they came along. It did manage to do a few things. I mean, there weren't huge things. There was stuff like hanging baskets being put up in Little Germany. But this is at a time when the economy wasn't doing very well, and there wasn't that much money around. And I think it was probably quite difficult really getting anything big going. You know, they didn't have any big money to play with. And so eventually this group got dissolved in 2021, so sadly has gone. And I'm not actually sure now whether my friend still lives in Little Germany. I have a feeling he's moved away, but I'm afraid I lost touch with him. There was a time, I think it is starting to change now, but there was a time not that long ago when the number of businesses and the number of residents started to drop. Generally speaking, city centre living in Bradford, we found, although there was a core of residents who were like long-term residents who wanted to settle there and make it their home, there's quite a transient population of people that live in the city centre. You compare it with some other cities, it's a bigger percentage, if you like, of transient people. So if you're transient, you get a job for 6 months or 12 months or something, and you just need somewhere to live, odds are you're not going to really take that much interest in what's going on around you. You know, you just want to work and come home, and that's it really. Not get involved with the community. I just said that. There were some plans at one point for a new hotel to be built on Wells Street, but I think Bradford Council was in favour of the scheme, but the problem was getting anybody to actually back it. They needed someone with money to put into it, so that ended up not going anywhere, sadly. It may have also just reflected that there wasn't really a need, perhaps, for a hotel. You know, it may not have worked out in the long run anyway. Sadly, I would say that the vision of the urban village that was put in the 2000s, that was proposed back then, hasn't yet been achieved. I mean, it's certainly the case when we talked in the previous session about Goitside. I mean, they didn't get anywhere near the same results. But having said that, there has been some positives. You know, to begin with, the initiative did start to really turn Little Germany around. And if the hole in the ground hadn't have appeared, it may well be a very different place by now. Sometimes you just can't plan for these sorts of things. But there's another side of things now. It's become very popular for filming historic dramas. Odds are, if a film crew is heading to Bradford, they're heading to Little Germany. So Downton Abbey, Gentleman Jack, Peaky Blinders, there's been so many different TV series which have made use of Little Germany as the backdrop for what they're doing, and it's great. It's great that the architecture of the buildings is being put to that sort of use, and it's being recognised that it's valuable. It's also pretty much the only one of the 20 or so districts that make up what is now Bradford City Centre that has retained its identity. And it wasn't the Little Germany Urban Village Company that resurrected that identity. It was already there. People still talked about Little Germany, as where so many of the other places in the other sessions we've talked about have faded away with history. So I would argue that in the long run, it will pick itself up. It will continue to attract more residents and businesses. It might not perhaps meet the vision that the Urban Village Company had of the high street and that sort of thing, but it may still continue to be a vibrant place. It may become more of a vibrant place than it currently is. I would think that of the various districts within central Bradford, that is probably going to be one of those that is more likely in the long run to succeed. I just want to briefly touch on some other areas that I've not had time during this programme of sessions to talk about. So there are other districts as well that people may or may not have heard of. So I was going to originally do a whole session on Lister Hills, but unfortunately it snowed, and it snowed very thick, and I live in Emsey near Skipton, and even leaving the village would have been almost impossible, let alone coming down to Bradford. So Lister Hills. Now the Lister Hills district is sometimes called the University Quarter these days. People tend to call it that rather than Lister Hills. And an urban myth is that Lister Hills was named after the Lister family that owned Lister's Mill in Manningham. It means the same thing, but it wasn't named after them. The name Lister, with an Y, is a medieval name. It means, it relates to the practice of cloth dyeing. A bit like dyer, the name dyer. So basically, Lister Hills expresses that there was a connection between that trade and this particular area. It's not to do with that family, but the reason Lister, the family Lister, will have that surname will be because there's a family, they will have a connection with the practice of cloth dyeing. So indirectly, so Lister Hills, like most of the lost neighbourhoods we've talked about in the past sessions, it was dominated by back-to-back terraces and mixed with industrial buildings, and without exception all of these areas became slum districts. Lister Hills was no less a slum district. But instead of clearing it, there's a slum clearance and then building social housing like they did in places like White Abbey, for instance. Between 1956 and 1960, most of Lister Hills was basically torn down to make way for the university's main campus. So they took on 60 acres of land, which included 22 streets of housing, as well as some run-down industrial buildings. They all got demolished. More recently, there's been a heritage project at the university where they actually uncovered some of the old cobbled streets that the campus was built on. So as you can see here, I think that's the Richmond building that's being constructed, and this is housing that was then.
So was this kind of between there and Tumbling Hill Street?
That's more the college end of thing. This was further up.
Right. Yeah.
So all of where the university is now, except the, you know where the old technical college used to be.
Yeah.
That was there previously. Bradford College called it the old building when I was really imaginatively named. So that was all there. But further up the hill, that basically was all housing. Up to sort of Shearbridge Road. Shearbridge Road. Right, another area, Berksland. Anybody any idea where Berksland was? No, bottom of Wakefield Road, actually. Wakefield Road. But yeah, were you thinking of Wakefield Road? Okay. If you go up Wakefield Road from Bradford City Centre, you get to a roundabout fairly early on. If you turn left, there is now the Berksland Industrial Estate. That was originally Berksland Neighbourhood. So all it is it's an industrial estate now rather than a neighbourhood. So the word Berk or Berks, it refers to an old English word for birch wood. So it basically expresses there was an abundance of birch trees around this area originally, but you have to go way, way back.
Wasn't the abattoir with birch?
Further down, yes, that's right.
That's what I thought.
Right. So this was the opposite side of Wakefield Road to where the Broomfields district was. Broomfields was the other side, Prospect Street, Hall Lane, that area. There was a Burke's Hall that was within this area, and that was there before the area then subsequently ended up with terraced housing, which was owned by the Richardson family, which also owned Bailey Hall, amongst others. They owned quite a few. It's funny, where I live now, they owned Gargrave Hall and what was the other one? Not Bradley Hall. Anyway, they owned halls going into what is now North Yorkshire as well. Must have taken them days by horse and cart to get up there. Anyway, the Burke's Hall basically became dilapidated. You ended up with this neighbourhood built around it that was back-to-backs. And in 1871, Bradford Corporation purchased the Burke's Hall site, and they demolished it and they built the gasworks in the area. I think now there's some plans to turn it into a hydrogen type of gasworks. So I suppose at least it's carrying on until the next thing comes along, I suppose.
They've actually been experimenting in Bradford for quite a few years, putting hydrogen into the natural gas supply. To see how much hydrogen they can put in before it changes its calorie by using everything. So yeah, they've been experimenting.
Has there been a lot of gas fires and explosions?
No, it hasn't had a significant difference. Well, there was 15 to 20% hydrogen into natural gas as an experiment to see if you could do that, obviously with gas supplies running out. So.
Okay.
Is Bradford being used to test that then?
Yeah, I think about 5 districts who are testing hydrogen in Bradford.
Okay. I didn't know that. The area was dominated by the railways. There was what was called the Bradford avoiding line that passed through. So this was mostly for freight trains not to have to go into the centre, that they could bypass Bradford Exchange.
Is that its official name?
Well, certainly seems to be the. Yeah, I think it was the official name actually. Yeah.
Really?
Bradford avoiding line. Yeah. Oh. And lo and behold, it became a slum area. There was some demolition in the 30s, but the rest of it wasn't cleared until the 1960s. I'm not sure about people in the 30s where they ended up, but I interviewed some residents who'd lived there in the 60s, and they were all relocated to Homewood, which at that time was a nice, shining new estate that was lovely. New Leeds. Anybody know where New Leeds is or was? Okay. Leeds Road. Yes, Leeds Road. So this adjoined Berksland at one end, Leeds Road at the other. in actual fact, if you looked on the old maps, you couldn't tell where Birksland ended and Leeds Road began. You know, they just all got merged into one, really. The name, it seems that when Leeds Road was built, it wasn't called Leeds Road, it was called New Leeds Road. So the road that we now refer to as Leeds Old Road was originally just called Leeds Road. Am I keeping up with that? Okay, so at some stage they decided to drop the new bit, maybe because it wasn't new anymore, and add the old to the old road. So this area became New Leeds because it was on New Leeds Road. Yes. That seems to... Now, I'm not 100% sure of that, but from what I've read and discussions I've had with other people, that seems to be the most likely answer. Now, in the 19th century, some of the local literature describes New Leeds as a village. There's a possibility, because most of the industrial development started at the other side of Bradford to begin with, that it was a bit more like a village at that point. But it soon changed. It's referred to in the 1845 Bradford Woolcombers report. This was almost a summary of inspections of different areas and properties in different areas across Bradford and how bad they were. And they generally didn't have a good thing to say about any part of Bradford. It was terrible for all sorts of reasons. Anyway, New Leeds was said to be an unhealthy area due to smoke and sulphur in the area. In the post-war period, it seems it had quite a relatively large population of Italian residents settling in the area. And eventually it was demolished in the 60s, basically. So will have been at the same time that Birksland was demolished. There was some social housing that was put up around New Leeds, although I don't think it was called New Leeds. But there was a new little council estate that was built just off Leeds Road. But it's gone. It went about 20 years ago or something like that. I think it was just one of these areas that had been left to go to rack and ruin, and they decided that they could do with getting rid of it.
So when they tie down Leeds Road, would it be, because at the very bottom obviously you've got New Germany, then you've got Eastbrook above there.
Yeah.
Is it on to the side?
It's just a little bit further out. So
Boynton Street or around that area, Downing Street, possibly. Oh no, because they're quite old, they're still there, aren't they?
There was a hospital near the bottom of Leeds
yeah.
Road. It was around that area. Just but not as you were going up Leeds Road, not on the left. It was on the right. It was the Leeds Road, the New Leeds area. George Street. Anybody know where George Street was?
No.
Okay. Cineworld complex. George Street was around there. It wasn't a very big neighbourhood. It was notorious, apparently. But all the neighbours were notorious. It had a lot of whist shops, which we've talked about in previous sessions. Whist shops were basically unlicensed pubs. So you'd get someone who would just set up a pub in their in the living room or whatever of it. And until the police came along and shut you down, and then suddenly another one would spring up the next week somewhere else. And these whist shops, as they tended to get nicknamed, they tended to be centres for black market activity, so stolen goods being traded. A lot of illegal gambling, prostitution, that sort of thing, really. Most of the whist shops in Bradford disappeared in, I think it was 1830, when there was an Act of Parliament that said that you could open a beer house, which was not like a pub where you could sell wine and spirits, but you could sell beer and cider, and that was it. And so most of them then became legal, because instead of getting a licence from the magistrates, where you had to prove you were a fit and proper person and bung a bit of money to the magistrate each year, you bought a certificate from the Exchequer, and that was all you needed to do. So they suddenly sprung up everywhere, and a lot of the whist shops suddenly went from black market to perfectly legal, but still carried on being raided by the police because of stuff. It seems likely that George Street was cleared during the post-war period, when the Broomfields district was also being cleared. It wasn't very large. and today the area is entirely commercial premises. So we're talking about where the courts are just a bit further up. Yeah, it was always a very small neighbourhood.
So around Bickle Lane area?
Yeah, the other side of Leeds Road, yeah, from Little Germany. Eastbrook. So, unsurprisingly, the name for this district comes from the East Brook, which is one of the many tributaries that go into the Bradford Beck. So this comes down from Lacedyke into the city centre, and it runs more or less parallel with Leeds Road. And apparently it was originally exposed. Well, I suppose all of them were originally exposed. And it extended really from the northeast of Little Germany towards Barker End. And like all the other areas densely back to backs, they're pretty much all the same as these areas. They've just got different names, really. 1845, Bradford Woolcomber's report mentions Eastbrook. Overcrowding, poor drainage, houses being surrounded by pigsties. As you do. And it looks like it was demolished in the post-war period, and it has today been given over mostly to industrial use. There are some very old mills around that area as well, which are generally falling down, you know, and not really being put to any use. Bellevue. So yeah, we're going along Manningham Lane now from the city centre. Location of the original Bellevue Boys Grammar School, Bellevue Hotel, Valley Parade is arguably in what was Bellevue. And it's different to the other areas. Oh, Busby's, I would say Busby's was probably just within the Bellevue area as well. Now, it's on some maps, but it isn't referred to in the Bradford Woolcombers report, and I think the reason is because it wasn't a working class neighbourhood. And if you look at the architecture and the fact that there was a hotel, you wouldn't have had a hotel in some of these other areas. So I think it was an area that held wealth, basically. I think we would say it was more of a middle class neighbourhood, really, considering the size and the appearance of the buildings, many of which continue to remain, but the name Bellevue doesn't really get used anymore. We tend to call it Manningham now rather than Bellevue. Brown Ride. So ride is an Old English word referring to a clearing of land which is often enclosed by a hedge. You get lots of rides. So we're looking at the western edge of the city centre, close to Thornton Road, a bit further out. The only things I could find that were interesting about Brown Ride really was that there was a reservoir that was built there, and it was basically to ensure there was a sufficient head of water being sent down through Bradford Beck to the Goyt. Now, if anybody hasn't been to one of the other sessions when we looked at Goyt side, a Goyt is a man-made or a human-made waterway, and it would have been used not like a canal, but it was used basically to divert water that then would have perhaps driven wheels, you know, mill wheels, that sort of thing, and then eventually it would be deposited back into its original natural watercourse. So that the Goyt leaves Bradford Beck, goes along, and then comes back into Bradford Beck. So the reservoir was designed by Bradford Borough engineer Charles Gott, and it opened in 1875 and apparently held 10.5 million gallons of water, which I think is a lot of water. I don't know how much it is, but it sounds a lot anyway. And it became a real haven for bird life. Apparently there were 39 species of bird observed there, but it wasn't open to the public. But that apparently didn't stop people from going. It's just that it wasn't open to the public, so you just unofficially went instead, I suppose. 1950s, the council had it emptied and filled in. What they found was that companies along the Goyt had been discharging waste into it, so basically the Goyt had become like an open sewer by that point. So, yeah, so that was the end of the reservoir.
It's interesting, there's Brownroy Hill in Bradford, but it's absolutely nowhere near there, is it? Yeah, going up the side of St. Scenic Road.
Right. I suppose it's like many places, though, that you get the same names occurring. Bridge Street. Right, where the Queen Pub is, near the interchange, that ends, near St George's Hall. So this was a neighbourhood originally. Apparently, people on Bridge Street were very well known for keeping pigs. And the assumption is this is an old habit from when people moved to places like Bradford from the countryside. So you know, people who migrated to Bradford looking for work, but they would continue living the same way that they used to when they lived in a village or a hamlet somewhere else. I'm sure it wasn't just Bridge Street. But there was a regular pig market held on Bridge Street until 1843. So there was a bit of a pig thing that was going on with Bridge Street. It had, I think this is Bowling Green Pub, I think it was called. There were some nice pubs and nice buildings apparently along Bridge Street, but the railways, when they came to Bradford, started to change the landscape, and the biggest impact on this area was when the Exchange station opened in 1850. And then after that, although obviously there is still a Bridge Street, in terms of being a neighbourhood, does not seem to be referred to in any literature after this. So I think it is fair to say that when the Exchange station opened, that was the end of it. You know, a bit like when the university was built, that was the end of Lister Hills, basically. Oh, just an interesting thing, by the way, because I would argue that St George's Hall is part of this area. Now, there is a bit of a myth. I've collected quite a few while I've been doing reading about the history of Bradford. There is a myth that that St George's Hall is the oldest concert hall in the world. It's not. It's nearly, but do anybody have any idea which is the oldest concert hall in the world? Settle Victoria Hall. Apparently, though, there was a difference between a concert hall and a music hall. So, do you think it was the oldest music hall in the world? No, it wasn't. Does anybody know what that was? City Varieties in Leeds. Yeah. But I think it's a matter of months between them. So,
what is the difference in the two of them?
Well, you have music in a music hall, but I suppose you can have other things in the concert hall. I don't know, but there is a difference, and apparently it's important. I don't know. I feel a bit embarrassed now bringing it up. I should have really known the answer to that. I'm not too embarrassed, a little bit. Yeah, but it is a matter of months. So I think it is a concert hall rather than a music hall at St George's Hall, and I think it's probably fair to say it's one of the oldest in the world, but it isn't the oldest in the world. Right. Finally, Lower Manchester Road. I'm not going to give any prizes out for people guessing where this was. And sometimes this was simply called the Manchester Road District. And this again, same as all the other places, densely packed neighbourhood, back-to-back terraces, becomes a slum. It's on the eastern side of Manchester Road, mostly bordering Bloomfields and the Little India district, as it later became. And like Little India, there were a lot of street names that reflected places from the Empire, like Adelaide Street around this area. So we'd said this morning when we looked at Ripleyville, Little India was a district that was built from surplus land that the Ripley family held, and the reason it was called Little India was because it had Calcutta Street and Bombay Street in it. So it was basically a nod to these places in the Empire. Now, Lower Manchester Road had a bit of a reputation for housing radicals. So apparently there were people that lived in the area that were generally regarded as being politically subversive. Because basically they wanted things like the vote and better conditions and factories and education and stuff like this, you know. Yeah.
Independent Labour Party was well, they have a monument just below the playhouse dedicated to the establishment.
Right. Right, this area extended right as far as Jacob's Well. You know where the Jacob's Well pub is and where the municipal buildings used to be behind? That was all originally built on. And in fact, it almost encroached onto City Hall, well, Town Hall as it was. It appears that mostly this area was demolished during the 60s, some remaining buildings in the 70s with the widening of Manchester Road. Okay, so that really brings me to the end of what I wanted to talk about. So if anybody has any questions or comments, now is the time to share them.